The wind screamed through the Bitterroot Mountains like a wounded animal, shaking the old cabin until it moaned. Inside, Jack Turner stood barefoot on the frozen floorboards, rifle in hand, staring at the door that trembled beneath heavy blows. Something was out there. Something big. The sound wasn't the frantic scratching of wolves or the groan of a falling branch. It was deliberate, slow, determined. Another thud. The lantern flickered. Jack's breath clouded the air as he cocked the rifle. The storm outside howled louder, drowning everything but the pounding at the door. And then it stopped. Silence pressed in. Jack's heart hammered as he whispered into the emptiness. "Who's out there?" Only the wind answered. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Snow fell in thick, suffocating sheets across the Bitterroot Range. It wasn't the kind of storm that came and went. It was the kind that swallowed the world. The kind that could erase a man if he stayed outside too long. Jack Turner knew that storm. He had lived through worse. Still, as he stood at the door of his cabin, listening to the wind whip through the pines, he couldn't shake the feeling that something out there was different this time. He set the rifle down beside the hearth and moved closer to the window. Frost webbed across the glass, the faint glow of the fire reflecting his tired eyes. His breath fogged the pain as he peered out into the storm. Nothing but white. The cabin groaned. Logs cracked. The smell of pine smoke clung to his coat as he turned back to the fire, feeding it another piece of wood. Sparks rose like fleeting ghosts. For a moment, Jack just stood there, silent, still, his thoughts drifting to a past he tried to bury. A woman's laugh, a child's voice calling his name. Then the sudden flash of wind, the avalanche of snow, the sound of screams swallowed by a storm just like this one. He clenched his jaw and forced the memories away. It had been 6 winters since that day. 6 winters since the mountain took everything he loved. Now, the mountain was all he had left. A knock at the door startled him. A single, soft tap this time. Not the heavy pounding from before, but something gentler. Jack froze. Out here, miles from town, no one just dropped by. He hesitated, then unlatched the door. A rush of cold air burst inside, stinging his skin. Standing in the snow was Mara Lawson, her parka dusted white, her cheeks flushed red from the wind. "Good Lord, Jack," she said, her voice half scolding, half relieved. "You'd freeze to death if I didn't check on you once in a while." Jack sighed and stepped aside. "You should have stayed in town, Mara. The roads'll be gone by nightfall. I'll make it back." She set down the sack she'd carried, beans, bread, coffee, the essentials, and warmed her hands near the fire. "You never come down to the store anymore. Figured you could use these." Jack nodded silently. He wasn't much for talk, but Mara filled the silence easily, like sunlight finding cracks through clouds. "You hear about Riley Grant?" she asked suddenly, glancing toward him. "He's been back up here? Says there's a grizzly roaming near the ridge. Big one, silver coat. He's hunting her." Jack looked up, his brow tightening. "This isn't hunting season." Mara's voice softened. "You know Riley. He doesn't wait for permission." The fire popped. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Jack muttered, "He'll get himself killed one of these days." Mara gave him a knowing smile. "And you'll pretend not to care." She looked around the cabin, the rough-hewn walls, the solitude that felt almost sacred. "You're not meant to live like this forever, Jack." He didn't answer. Instead, he poured her a mug of coffee and handed it over. The gesture said more than words ever could. When she left, dusk was already crawling down the mountains. The storm thickened, devouring the world beyond the window. Jack stood in the doorway, watching her taillights vanish into white nothingness. Night came fast. The fire burned low, throwing restless shadows against the walls. Jack sat in his chair, the rifle within reach, listening to the storm's rhythm. Then another sound. Faint at first, buried beneath the howl of wind. A deep, rhythmic thumping. He stood, muscles tightening. There it was again. Thud. Then a low, guttural moan carried through the wind. Not human, not quite animal either. Jack moved to the door, gripping the handle. Probably just a tree, he muttered. But the lie didn't convince even him. He cracked the door open. The storm slammed against him, icy air biting his face, and through the swirling snow he saw movement, massive and slow. A shape stumbled toward the porch, collapsing onto the steps. Jack's eyes widened. A grizzly bear, huge and half-frozen, lay sprawled in the snow. Her fur was matted with ice, her sides heaving in slow, painful breaths. And then he saw them. 2 tiny cubs clinging to her, their fur crusted white, their little bodies trembling. Instinct kicked in. Jack reached for his rifle but stopped. The mother wasn't charging, she wasn't even moving. Her eyes, deep brown and glazed with exhaustion, lifted to meet his. There was no rage there, no threat, only desperation. The cubs whimpered. One tried to stand and fell, letting out a pitiful cry that cut through the storm like a knife. Jack stood frozen, torn between every instinct that screamed close the door and something deeper that whispered, help them. He looked at the firelight flickering behind him, then back at the dying creatures before him. Damn it, he muttered under his breath. He lowered the rifle, stepped back, and opened the door wide. The mother bear hesitated, then dragged herself forward, her claws scraping the wooden porch. The cubs followed, stumbling through the snow, barely alive. As they crossed the threshold, Jack felt the weight of what he'd just done settle on him like the storm outside. A wild grizzly and her cubs were now inside his home. The fire hissed as melting ice dripped onto the floor. The mother let out a long, weary breath and collapsed near the hearth, her cubs curling against her belly. Jack stood there, rifle hanging loose at his side, heart pounding. The world outside howled, but inside, an impossible silence filled the room. He whispered, almost to himself, "What the hell have I done?" The cubs stirred, one of them letting out a soft whine, almost like a sigh. And as Jack stared into the mother's eyes, something shifted, something he hadn't felt in years. A spark of life, a fragile thread of connection. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, a truce had begun. The storm raged through the night, clawing at the cabin walls as if trying to tear them down. The fire hissed and spat, shadows crawling over the timbered walls. Jack Turner stood motionless near the door, the rifle hanging loosely in his hand. His breath was ragged, his pulse hammering like a drum. The grizzly mother lay stretched near the hearth, her massive body steaming as the ice melted from her fur. The cubs had huddled close to her belly, their small frames trembling violently, their tiny whimpers rising and fading with every gust of wind. He couldn't believe what he'd done. A wild bear, inside his home. The air was thick with the heavy scent of wet fur and smoke. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots as he took a cautious step closer. The bear's eyes flicked open, dark and glassy, but she didn't move. She didn't snarl. She only breathed, slow and shallow, as if every exhale cost her strength she didn't have. Jack swallowed hard. His instincts screamed to push her back out, to reclaim his space, but the sight of those cubs stopped him. Their ribs showed through their soaked fur. They were starving, dying, just like their mother. He set the rifle down slowly, like a man surrendering. "All right," he murmured, voice rough from disuse. "You win. But don't you dare make me regret it." He moved toward the kitchen shelf, his boots crunching against the frozen puddles that had already formed on the floor. He found a can of beans and another of stew, his hands trembling slightly as he opened them. He poured a little into a metal bowl and set it near the bears, not too close. Close enough for them to smell. The smaller cub lifted its head, nose twitching, then took a wobbling step forward. It sniffed the food, uncertain. The mother bear gave a faint rumble, low, weak, but not hostile. Encouragement, maybe. The cub began to eat. Slowly at first, then desperately, licking every drop it could find. The second cub followed, pressing its muzzle into the bowl. Jack watched from a few feet away, his chest tightening. He hadn't seen hunger like that since before the storm that took everything from him. He remembered the way his son's lips had turned blue, the way his wife's eyes had begged him to find warmth where there was none. He shook the memory off like snow from his shoulders and turned to the fire, throwing in another log. Sparks leapt into the air. The warmth spread slowly, pushing back the chill that had gripped the room. The mother bear shifted her weight slightly, letting out a deep, rattling breath. Jack glanced at her. She was massive, even in her weakened state. If she wanted to, she could kill him before he reached the door. Yet somehow, he didn't feel fear. Not the kind that made his muscles tense or his heart race. This was something different, uneasy, yes, but filled with an odd respect. He sat down in his chair, still watching. The cubs had finished eating and crawled back to their mother, nestling against her side. Their breathing slowed, the tiny tremors fading as the heat from the fire seeped into their small bodies. Jack leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You picked the wrong place to die," he whispered. The grizzly lifted her head just enough for their eyes to meet again. Something passed between them, a quiet acknowledgement, a fragile truce. Hours passed. The storm outside refused to stop. Snow piled high against the windows, and the wind screamed through every crack in the wood. Inside, time stretched thin, measured only by the slow crackle of the fire. Jack's eyelids grew heavy. He hadn't slept properly in days. He told himself he'd rest just a moment, rifle still within reach. The last thing he saw before drifting off was the shadow of the bear's massive form lying still beside the fire. When he woke, dawn had not yet broken. The fire was dying, embers glowing faintly like the last heartbeat of the night. He stirred, his body stiff, and sat upright, blinking at the sight before him. The grizzly was awake. Her head was lifted, her eyes sharp now, watching him closely. For a second, neither moved. The cabin was silent except for the faint hiss of wind against the window. Jack could feel her strength returning. He raised his hands slowly, showing her he meant no harm. "Easy," he murmured. "We're both still here." The bear didn't move. Her gaze followed him as he rose and added another log to the fire. The warmth flared again, bathing them both in orange light. The cubs stirred, mewling softly. Jack studied the mother's posture. She was tired, yes, but not afraid. Not anymore. The tension that had filled the room the night before had softened, replaced by something quieter, an understanding that neither of them wanted a fight. He poured water into a kettle and set it on the stove. The hiss of steam filled the silence. Outside, the wind was fading, leaving behind a stillness so deep it almost hurt. Jack moved to the window and looked out. The world beyond was unrecognizable. Trees bowed beneath the weight of snow. The mountains were shrouded in fog, and down the slope, the path toward the ridge was buried completely. He exhaled slowly. "Looks like we're stuck here," he muttered. When he turned back, he caught sight of something that made him stop. The smaller cub had wandered closer, sniffing at his boots. Its tiny nose was wet and black, its fur still patchy from the frost. Jack froze, not wanting to frighten it. The cub tilted its head, curious, then scurried back to its mother. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, his first in years. He crouched beside the hearth, poking at the fire. The bear's eyes followed his every move, cautious but not fearful. He could feel the weight of her gaze, heavy but not threatening. "You're not supposed to be here," he said again, this time softer. "Neither am I guess." The bear's breathing deepened. The sound filled the room, steady and rhythmic. Jack leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. The exhaustion he'd carried for years began to loosen, piece by piece, like ice melting under the first touch of spring. The fire crackled. The wind had died completely now. For the first time in what felt like forever, the cabin wasn't filled with the noise of his own loneliness. He thought of Mara. She'd probably be stuck in town, snowed in. She'd worry about him, as she always did. He could almost hear her voice. "You can't shut the world out forever, Jack." Maybe she was right. The bears slept through the morning. Jack worked quietly, drying their wet footprints, hanging his coat by the fire, checking his food supply. There wasn't much left. 2 jars of stew, a half sack of flour, and a few strips of dried meat. It would have lasted him through February, maybe. But now there were mouths to feed. He sighed. "Guess we'll figure it out tomorrow." The grizzly stirred, her head lifting once more. Their eyes met again, and for a moment, Jack imagined she understood every word. Outside, a pale light began to creep through the frost-covered window. The storm had finally broken. Jack stood at the door, watching the quiet world beyond. The air was sharp, clean, endless. He didn't know how long the bears would stay, or what would happen when they left. But one thing was certain. Something inside him had shifted. Behind him, the soft sound of breathing filled the room, steady and alive. He looked back, murmuring to himself, "You're safe here. For now." And as the light of morning spread across the frozen forest, Jack Turner, once a man who had lost everything, realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't alone anymore. The morning after the storm was so still that the world seemed to be holding its breath. Snow blanketed the Bitterroot Valley, smooth and unbroken, reflecting the faint gold of dawn. The silence was deafening. No wind, no birds, not even the creak of trees. Just a frozen stillness that made the cabin feel like a fragile heartbeat in the middle of nowhere. Jack Turner stood by the window, staring out at the whiteness. He'd survived countless Montana winters, but never one like this. The storm had stripped the landscape bare. Even the pines looked bowed in surrender. Behind him, the fire whispered softly. He turned, half expecting the bears to be gone. But they were still there. Real, solid, breathing. The grizzly mother lay on her side, her 2 cubs nestled close, tiny mounds of fur rising and falling with slow breaths. The sight was both peaceful and absurd. A man living in solitude, sharing his cabin with a family of grizzlies. Jack rubbed a hand over his face. "You're not supposed to be here," he muttered again, though there was no anger in it this time, just wonder. He moved quietly through the cabin, careful not to startle them. The floorboards creaked softly under his boots. He fetched water from the metal pot near the stove, poured some into a bowl, and slid it closer to the mother. She stirred, nostrils flaring, eyes blinking open. For a moment, their gazes met again. "You're still breathing." "That's something," he said softly. The bear didn't move, but her eyes followed him as he reached for the kettle. The cubs stirred, one letting out a tiny sound that almost resembled a sigh. Jack smiled despite himself. He sat in his chair, sipping coffee gone cold, trying to think. The storm had sealed him off from everything. His supplies wouldn't last long, not for 3 extra mouths. He'd have to hunt again soon. The thought made his chest tighten. Leaving meant risking everything, but staying meant letting them starve. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, a low, moaning sound that carried through the trees. The weight of the mountain pressed down on him. By midday, the cubs were awake and restless, tumbling over one another near the hearth. The smaller one, thin and wide-eyed, wandered too close to Jack's boots again, sniffing curiously. He froze, barely breathing. Then the cub sneezed, stumbled backward, and darted to its mother. Jack chuckled under his breath. "You and I aren't that different, kid." Both just trying to survive. The bear's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. Her massive head lifted slightly. She was stronger now. He could see it in the way her chest rose more steadily, in the faint glimmer of life returning to her eyes. But there was something else in that look, something old and knowing. As if she understood this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about trust. Later that afternoon, the wind shifted. The temperature dropped again, sharp and sudden. Jack threw on his coat and stepped outside. The snow was knee-deep, crisp under his boots. He trudged toward the small woodpile, breath curling in the cold. Each step sent a quiet crunch echoing through the forest. He could feel eyes on him. He always could in the wilderness. But this time it wasn't the bear. It was something farther off, watching, listening. He stopped and scanned the tree line. Nothing but the endless wall of white. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling. He gathered what he could and went back inside, shutting the door firmly behind him. The bears hadn't moved much. The firelight shimmered across their fur. The cubs curled in sleep again. Jack sat back down, rubbing warmth into his hands. "You'll have to leave soon," he murmured. "When the snow softens." The bear's eyes flicked toward him again, and for a second, he felt ridiculous, talking to a creature that couldn't understand him. But the longer he looked, the more he wasn't sure that was true. The next day came gray and heavy. The storm had passed, but the world outside was frozen in its aftermath. Jack was checking his traps along the edge of the cabin when he heard the crunch of footsteps behind him. Not animal, but human. He turned sharply, rifle half raised, only to see Mara Lawson trudging through the snow, her parka a blur of red against the white wilderness. "Mara?" he called, disbelief in his voice. She waved, breath clouding the air. "You didn't think I'd let you freeze up here, did you?" Jack met her halfway, taking the crate she carried. "You shouldn't be out here." The storm barely passed. "I know," she said, brushing snow from her sleeves. "But you didn't come down after the storm." Thought you might have gotten yourself buried. Jack hesitated, shifting his weight. I'm fine. Cabin held up. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You look different, he forced a shrug. Must be the beard. Uh-huh. She gave him that knowing look that always saw through his walls. Anyway, I brought some flour, jerky, and coffee. Figured you'd run low. Jack's stomach tightened with guilt. He couldn't tell her what he was feeding. Thanks. You didn't have to, I know, she said gently. But I wanted to. They stood in the cold for a moment, silence stretching between them like an unspoken history. Then she said quietly, Jack, you heard about Riley Grant? He stiffened. He's back on the ridge. Says he's tracking something big. A grizzly, maybe. Been talking about it for days. Jack's jaw clenched. He's not supposed to be hunting this time of year. Mara frowned. When has that ever stopped him? You know what Riley's like. He'd shoot his own shadow if it meant a payday. He looked away, snowflakes catching in his beard. He'll move on. I hope so, she said softly. Just be careful, all right? You've got a good heart, Jack, but it's going to get you killed one of these days. He met her eyes, the hint of a smile ghosting across his face. It already almost did. She didn't ask what he meant. She just squeezed his arm gently before turning back toward the trail. Jack watched until her red coat vanished into the trees, the sound of her steps fading into the wind. When he returned inside, the bears were still there. The mother lifted her head briefly as the door opened, then lowered it again. The cubs were tangled together in a heap of fur and blankets. Jack set the crate on the table and exhaled slowly. The cabin smelled of wood smoke, fur, and something else. Life. He took one of Mara's jerky strips, cut it into pieces, and placed them near the bears. The cubs sniffed eagerly. The mother didn't interfere. Guess that's a yes, he murmured. He sat near the fire, watching them eat, feeling the warmth seep into his bones. The storm outside had stolen the noise from the world, but here, in this fragile silence, something alive had taken its place. The firelight caught the edge of his face as he looked toward the door. He could almost hear Mara's voice echoing in his mind. Be careful. He knew Riley Grant too well. If the man was tracking a grizzly, he'd follow her trail until he found it. Jack's eyes drifted toward the mother bear, sleeping peacefully by the fire. Her breath came steady now, strong. The cubs pressed against her side, safe for the moment. But safety was temporary in the mountains. Always was. He reached for his rifle, checking the chamber out of habit, and leaned it beside the door. Tomorrow he'd have to go out, find food, check the traps farther down the ridge. But even as he told himself that, a quiet unease settled in his gut. Something in the air felt heavier now, like the calm before another storm, one that had nothing to do with the weather. He looked back at the sleeping bears. We'll figure it out, he said softly. Outside, snow began to fall again, slow, deliberate, and endless, covering the world in silence once more. And somewhere beyond the tree line, far out on the ridge, a man named Riley Grant followed fresh tracks through the snow, his rifle slung across his shoulder and a cruel smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The morning came with a pale sun bleeding through the clouds, a fragile light that touched the frozen forest but gave no warmth. Jack Turner pulled on his coat and stepped outside, the wooden door groaning shut behind him. The air was sharp, clean, and painfully quiet. His boots crunched into the deep snow as he made his way toward the line of traps he'd set before the storm. He'd left the grizzly mother and her cubs inside, curled near the hearth. For some reason, he'd felt uneasy about leaving them, though he couldn't have explained why. The mother had gained strength. Her breathing was deep and even now. She watched him every time he moved, not with fear but awareness. He was no longer a stranger to her, but neither was he fully trusted. The wind was slow but cold enough to bite through his gloves. Jack trudged along the ridge, eyes scanning the trees. The wilderness was endless, miles of pine and silence, where a man could disappear without a trace. He found his first trap half buried in snow, empty. The second held a snowshoe hare, stiff and frozen, its small body limp in the steel jaws. "You'll do," Jack muttered, prying it free. Further along, he found a grouse caught in another trap, feathers ruffled by the wind. He tied both kills together, slinging them over his shoulder. It wasn't much, but it would feed them all for another day or two. When he finally turned back toward the cabin, something made him stop, a feeling first, then the faint sound of movement. He froze, every sense sharpening. It wasn't the sound of wind or falling snow. This was deliberate, slow, heavy, distant. Jack crouched low, eyes sweeping the trees. Nothing moved, but the forest had changed. The silence was too deep, too deliberate. He felt the same prickling along his spine that he'd felt during old hunts, when something else was watching. He adjusted his rifle strap and started moving again, careful and steady. Whatever it wasn't close enough yet to worry him, but not far enough to ignore. When Jack returned to the cabin, the fire was low, but the warmth still clung to the air. The grizzly mother lifted her head the moment he stepped inside. Her eyes were alert, sharper now, like amber glass catching the light. "Still here," he said softly, setting his rifle by the door. "Didn't burn the place down, I see." He skinned the hare quickly, slicing through the fur with practiced hands. The smell of raw meat stirred the cubs. One of them lifted its head, nose twitching. Jack smiled faintly. "You smell that, huh?" He cut the meat into strips, cooked some in the pan over the fire, and left the rest raw on a small wooden board. When he placed it near the mother, she didn't growl or bare her teeth. She sniffed, then, slowly, began to eat. It wasn't hunger that caught Jack's breath, but the grace of it. Careful, deliberate, not desperate. The cubs joined her, nudging close, their small paws pressing into the floorboards. For the first time, Jack didn't stand guard with the rifle nearby. He just watched. The firelight flickered across fur and wood and skin, 3 creatures sharing a home that had never been meant for such things. He caught himself whispering, "Maybe there's room for all of us after all." Miles away, a snow-covered ridge cut through the forest like a scar. Riley Grant trudged along the slope, breath puffing in white clouds. His parka was heavy, his face rough with frostbite, but his eyes burned bright. He crouched beside a half-buried paw print, brushing the snow away. "There you are," he murmured. The tracks were fresh, too fresh. The prints led down toward the valley where Jack's cabin sat hidden beneath the trees. Riley smiled, a sharp, cruel curve of his lips. "You didn't get far, did you, girl?" He slung his rifle across his back and started following the tracks. Back at the cabin, Jack stood at the window, watching the snow drift lazily down. The cubs had fallen asleep again, one of them nestled in the old wool blanket he'd thrown on the floor. The mother bear's breathing was steady, deep, stronger than before. Something eased inside him as he watched them. He hadn't realized how lonely he'd been until the silence had been filled. It wasn't conversation that had healed him. It was presence. The steady sound of another heartbeat in the same room. He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter, letting the warmth spread through his hands. "Guess you're stuck with me for a while," he said quietly. He thought again of Mara. She'd be back when the roads cleared, probably with more questions than answers. He didn't know how he'd explain this to her, or to anyone. Who would believe it? The mother bear shifted her weight, groaning softly as she lay her head down again. The fire cracked, and Jack stared at the flickering light. The quiet was comfortable, peaceful, but that peace was fragile. Because out there, beyond the ridge, Riley Grant was closing in. By late afternoon, the wind had returned, dragging clouds across the sky. Jack decided to check the traps one more time before dark. The bears needed food, and he needed to make sure the storm hadn't buried his path completely. He loaded his rifle, pulled on his gloves, and stepped outside. The cold bit through the seams of his jacket, but he didn't mind. He'd lived his life in this cold. It was the one thing that had never lied to him. Halfway down the ridge, he noticed new tracks. They weren't animal, too straight, too heavy. Human boots. Jack crouched, brushing snow from the prints. Whoever it was had come from the northern trail, moving toward the cabin. His pulse quickened. He knew those prints. The stride was long, deliberate, confident. "Riley," he muttered. He followed the tracks for a while until they veered off toward the river. There was nothing he could do for now. He turned back, gripping the rifle tighter. When he reached the cabin again, the first thing he did was check the door. Closed. The fire still burned. The bears were safe. But the unease in his chest wouldn't settle. He poured himself another cup of coffee and sat near the window. The woods beyond were dark now, shadows deepening between the trees. Somewhere out there, he knew Riley Grant was setting up camp, or maybe worse, watching from the dark. The bear stirred again, sniffing the air. Her head turned toward the door, ears twitching. Jack felt it too, the faint shift in the air, the sense of another presence. He whispered, "It's all right." Not tonight, but even as he said it, he didn't believe it. The hours crept by. Night swallowed the forest. Jack kept the fire burning low, the glow casting long shadows on the walls. He sat awake, rifle across his lap, staring at the door. The mother bear hadn't moved since sundown. The cubs slept quietly. Outside, the snow fell in slow, heavy flakes, muffling every sound. Then, just for a moment, he heard it, the faint crunch of footsteps outside. Deliberate. Close. Jack's body tensed. The steps paused right outside the door. He held his breath, finger brushing the trigger. But after a long moment, the sound faded, replaced once more by the whisper of falling snow. He didn't move for a long time, listening to the silence until it became unbearable. Finally, he exhaled and leaned back in his chair. "Tomorrow," he whispered to the fire. "I'll deal with it tomorrow." The flames flickered, painting the walls gold and red. The grizzly mother shifted in her sleep, one massive paw curling protectively around her cubs. And outside, somewhere beyond the trees, Riley Grant stood in the dark, his breath curling into the cold night air. He had found the cabin. He smiled faintly. "Didn't think you'd make friends with the wild, Turner. Guess I was wrong." He raised his rifle, eyes narrowing through the falling snow. "Tomorrow," he whispered back. Tomorrow, I'll take her." The forest swallowed his words, and the night pressed on, heavy with the promise of what was coming. Night fell heavy over the Bitterroot Mountains. The air was motionless, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. The sky was dark enough to swallow light, the kind of darkness that made a man's own heartbeat sound too loud. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, filling the room with a warm, amber glow. The bears slept near the hearth, the mother stretched out, the cubs curled tightly against her side. Jack Turner sat at the small wooden table, sharpening his knife in slow, deliberate strokes. Each scrape against the whetstone echoed softly through the room. He wasn't sure why he was so restless. Maybe it was the silence, or maybe it was what he had felt the night before, the unmistakable sense of being watched. He glanced at the rifle leaning against the wall. It wasn't paranoia. Not here. Not in these mountains. When something watched you out here, it usually meant you weren't alone. Jack set the knife down and rubbed his hands over his face. He hadn't slept properly in days. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it again. The blizzard, the frozen faces of his wife and son, the way the storm had taken them without mercy. He'd survived by chance, not courage. Since then, he'd lived like a ghost. But now, for the first time in years, there was something alive in this cabin besides him. Something worth protecting. The fire crackled softly, breaking his thoughts. The mother bear shifted, letting out a deep, rumbling exhale. Her cubs stirred but didn't wake. Jack smiled faintly. He'd grown used to the sound of them, the rhythm of their breathing, the soft scrape of claws on wood. Then came a sound that didn't belong. 3 sharp knocks at the door. Jack froze. His head lifted slowly, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. For a long moment, he didn't move. No one knocked out here. Not at this hour. Not in this wilderness. The bears stirred instantly. The mother raised her head, ears twitching, nostrils flaring. A low growl built in her chest, deep and vibrating through the floorboards. Jack stood, moving silently toward the door. He picked up the rifle and held it low. The knocks came again, louder this time, insistent. He took a slow breath, unlatched the door, and pulled it open. A gust of freezing air swept in, scattering snow across the floor. And there he was. Riley Grant, his parka dusted white, his face half hidden beneath a hood. The look in his eyes was all too familiar. Cold, calculating, dangerous. "Evening, Turner," he said, voice rough from the cold. "Didn't think anyone was home." Jack's grip on the rifle tightened. "What do you want, Riley?" Riley stepped forward, his boots crunching against the porch. "Saw smoke earlier. Thought maybe someone needed help." His lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Looks like you've got company instead." Jack didn't turn, but he knew Riley could see past him. The glow of the fire made the bears' shapes visible, massive, unmistakable. Riley's expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief, then to greed. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "That's her. The silver grizzly. Been tracking her for days." "Not anymore," Jack said quietly. Riley's eyes flicked back to him. "You're protecting her?" He let out a short, humorless laugh. "You really have lost your mind." "She's not a threat." Riley snorted. "Not a threat?" "She's a wild animal, Jack. The second she's strong enough, she'll rip you to pieces." You know that Jack didn't answer. The bear had risen now, her full height a dark silhouette behind him. She didn't roar or lunge. She just stood there, her muscles tense, her gaze locked on Riley. Riley's hand twitched toward the rifle slung over his shoulder. Step aside, he said. You don't want to be between me and her. Jack's voice hardened. You take one step closer, and I'll put you in the snow. Riley hesitated, the smirk fading from his face. The two men stared at each other, two relics of the same wilderness, both too stubborn to yield. You always thought you knew better, Riley said finally. Always preaching about respect for the wild, as if it gives a damn about you. Jack's eyes narrowed. Maybe it doesn't. But that doesn't mean I have to be like you. Riley's fingers brushed his rifle strap. Last chance, Turner. Behind Jack, the grizzly let out a sound, a low, guttural growl that filled the room like thunder. The cubs whimpered. The air felt charged, electric. Jack raised his rifle, not at the bear, but at Riley. You're not killing her, he said calmly. Not while I'm standing here. Riley's eyes flared with anger. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, slowly, he lowered his hand. You're making a mistake, he muttered. That thing will turn on you the second it can. Jack's grip didn't waver. Maybe. But it won't be tonight. For a long moment, the two men stood there in the doorway, the firelight flickering between them, snow swirling around Riley's boots. Finally, the hunter shook his head. You always were a fool, Jack, he said, voice thick with disdain. You let the wild break you once, and now you're letting it finish the job. He stepped back into the storm, the wind catching his coat. Don't say I didn't warn you. Jack watched until the darkness swallowed him, until the sound of his footsteps vanished into the snow. Only then did he close the door. The silence that followed was heavy, almost sacred. The mother bear stood motionless for a long time, her eyes fixed on Jack. He could feel her watching him, gauging, judging. Then she exhaled, a deep, steady sound, and sank back down near the fire. Jack lowered the rifle slowly. His hands trembled. He wasn't sure if it was from adrenaline or something else, something like relief. He sat back in his chair, staring at the flames. He won't be back tonight, he said softly, though he didn't quite believe it. The bear blinked once, her gaze steady. For a moment, it almost felt like understanding. The cubs nestled closer to her side, one letting out a soft, sleepy whimper. Jack leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His voice was quiet, more to himself than to her. You could have killed me that first night. You didn't. Guess I owe you for that. The bear closed her eyes, her breathing slow and even once more. Outside, the wind began to rise again, sweeping across the mountains like a whisper of warning. Jack stared into the fire, his thoughts dark and restless. He'd faced the wilderness before, but this was different. This wasn't just about surviving. It was about choosing what kind of man he wanted to be. He reached out, stoked the fire, and let his gaze wander to the door. The latch still rattled softly in the wind. He could almost hear Riley's voice echoing in his head. You're making a mistake. Maybe he was. But as he looked at the bear and her cubs, safe and warm by the fire, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let them die. Not now. Not after everything. The flames crackled, painting the cabin in soft gold. Outside, the storm gathered again, wrapping the mountains in silence. Jack sat alone in the flickering light, the rifle resting across his knees, waiting for whatever tomorrow might bring. And far beyond the ridge in the darkness, Riley Grant was watching the glow from the cabin window, eyes cold, breath rising in mist. He raised his rifle, sighting through the scope. Then, slowly, he lowered it again, a cruel smile tugging at his lips. Tomorrow, he whispered into the wind. Tomorrow, Turner." The snow swallowed his words, and the forest held its breath once more. The dawn came slow and gray, the kind of light that didn't so much rise as bleed through the clouds. The storm had passed, leaving the forest blanketed in silence. The air was brittle with cold, the trees heavy with snow. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to embers, their glow faint but steady. Jack Turner sat by the window, a mug of coffee cradled in his rough hands. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, though what he saw wasn't the snow. It was movement. A flicker of shadow where no shadow should be. He knew what it meant. Riley Grant hadn't left. Behind him, the Grizzly mother stirred. Her fur caught the early light like silver frost. She rose slowly, muscles rippling under her thick coat. The cubs blinked sleepily, then nestled closer to her, unaware of the danger creeping through the trees outside. Jack stood and reached for his rifle. The familiar weight steadied him, though he felt no comfort in it. He had faced storms, starvation, and solitude, but what waited beyond that tree line felt heavier than any of them. He moved to the door, opening it just enough to let in a sliver of morning air. The world outside was still, too still. "Stay quiet," he whispered to the bears, though he wasn't sure why. They couldn't understand him, but somehow it felt right to say it. He stepped outside. The cold hit him like a blade. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he walked a few yards from the cabin. His breath fogged the air in white clouds. Then he saw it, movement near the tree line. Riley. The man stepped out from behind a pine, rifle slung low, eyes locked on the cabin. He looked like he hadn't slept. His face was pale, his expression set in something grim and final. "Morning, Turner," Riley called. "Didn't think I'd find you awake." Jack didn't raise his rifle yet. "You don't have to do this." Riley laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Don't have to." "Jack, I've been tracking that bear for 2 weeks. You think I'm walking away now?" "She's not just some trophy," Jack said. "She's got cubs. You kill her, you kill them too." Riley shrugged. "That's nature. Circle of life, right? Besides, it's not like you've gone soft or anything." Jack's voice was quiet, steady. "You don't know what soft is. You've never lost something you couldn't replace." Riley's eyes hardened. "Don't start preaching." "Move aside," Jack shook his head. "No." A long silence followed. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the smell of pine and smoke. Then Riley lifted his rifle. The shot cracked through the morning. Jack dove behind a snowbank as the bullet splintered the cabin wall behind him. He rolled, brought his rifle up, and fired once in warning. The shot struck a nearby tree, sending bark flying. "Damn it, Riley!" he shouted. "You're not thinking straight." "Don't you get it?" Riley's voice echoed through the cold. "It's not about thinking. It's about surviving." Another shot rang out. Jack ducked, snow bursting around him. He could hear the bears inside the cabin now, the cubs whining, the mother's low growl rumbling like distant thunder. Then came the sound of wood splintering, the cabin door bursting open. The Grizzly mother charged into the snow, her roar shattering the silence. Riley turned, eyes wide, raising his rifle too late. The bear was on him in seconds, massive and furious. All the strength she had regained unleashed in one terrible surge. She knocked him backward into the snow, his gun skidding out of reach. Jack ran forward, shouting, "No!" "Stop." But it was too late. The bear stood over Riley, her breath heavy, jaws open wide. Riley's hand reached for the rifle, fingers trembling, but Jack got there first. He grabbed the weapon, flinging it aside, then stood between the hunter and the beast. "Easy," Jack said, voice firm but calm. "It's over." The grizzly's eyes locked on him, her chest heaving. Snow clung to her fur, her breath coming in great white clouds. For a long moment, the world held still, the man, the bear, the broken hunter lying between them. Then, slowly, the bear lowered her head. She turned toward the cabin, her cubs watching from the doorway, and lumbered back to them without another sound. Jack exhaled shakily. The wind carried away the last echo of her roar. Riley lay in the snow, staring up at the sky, gasping for breath. Blood streaked his cheek from a shallow gash, but he was alive. Barely. Jack knelt beside him. "You're lucky she let you walk away." Riley's laugh was hoarse, bitter. "You call that walking away?" He looked at Jack, something breaking in his expression. "You're a fool, Turner. You think that thing cares about you? You're just another piece of this place. When she's hungry again, you'll see." Jack didn't answer. He looked toward the cabin, where the bears were now inside again. The cubs pressed against their mother, safe. "Maybe," he said quietly. "But at least she knows mercy." Riley's mouth twisted, but he said nothing. Jack helped him up and walked him to the trail that led down the mountain. "Follow the river. You'll hit town by nightfall," Jack said. "And don't come back here." Riley met his eyes. "You can't save them all, Jack." Jack's voice was calm. "I just saved one. That's enough for me." He watched until Riley disappeared into the trees, his figure swallowed by the white wilderness. Then he turned back toward the cabin. Inside, the fire had burned low again. The bears lay where they had been, breathing steady. Jack set his rifle down and sank into the chair, every muscle in his body aching. For a long time, he just watched them. The cubs were sleeping now, one paw draped over the other. The mother bear lifted her head once, her eyes meeting his. There was no fear there, no hostility, just quiet understanding. "You're free now," Jack said softly. "You should go while you can." But the bear didn't move. She only blinked, slow and steady, before resting her head back down. Jack smiled faintly. He knew she wouldn't stay forever. Spring would come, the snow would melt, the forest would call her home. But for now, for this one fragile moment, they shared the same shelter, the same warmth, the same peace. Outside, the sun finally broke through the clouds, turning the world to gold. The mountains glittered with light, and the silence of the wilderness felt different now. Not empty, but full. Jack leaned back, his eyes drifting toward the fire. In that quiet cabin, high in the Bitterroot Mountains, a man who had once lost everything found something again. Something wild, something wordless, something real. And as the fire crackled and the grizzly breathed beside him, Jack Turner understood what the wilderness had been trying to teach him all along. Sometimes, the only way to find your humanity is to show mercy to something that the world calls untamable. The flames flickered higher, the cubs sighed in their sleep, and outside, the snow began to fall again. Soft, endless, forgiving. I hope you enjoyed this story. Subscribe to my channel so you don't miss touching stories. Leave a like and then comment below what you thought of the emotional stories. See you in the next video.